To the next slide. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you, and just really welcome. Please feel free to interrupt, to put questions into the chat. I know that for many of you, you have worked in quality improvement, and for some of you, it is new, and really feel open and welcome to kind of adjusting what will be most helpful for you. So Lauren did kind of a more formal bio. I'd like to put this on here just so you have a little bit of a sense of who I am and what I do. I teach our Improvement Coach program. I'm also an improvement advisor on externally facing work, including some work on maternal mortality and value improvement at the front line, and have kind of worked on a number of things over the years. I think maybe most importantly is I annoy my husband and 1.5-year-old by applying improvement science to our life. So I had all kinds of running control charts on his sleep when he was an infant, and many other things like trying to get out the door in the morning and process mapping. So I take this very seriously and love learning more to help me both personally and professionally. So if you go to the next slide. So first I was going to just start with a little bit of an overview about kind of why quality improvement, why is that important to the clinical content that you are all trying to advance. And so if you go to the next slide, you know, I really love this quote because I think it epitomizes for me why we need improvement. And so this comes from a really interesting article about wicked problems and complexity. But Lawrence Peters, the author, says some problems are so complex that you have to be highly intelligent and well-informed just to be undecided about them. And if I think about working on maternal and neonatal health, there's probably not a problem more complex. You have 2 patients, you have a large care team that is trying to care for both of those patients. And so really, I think as complexity goes, the work that you are all doing is incredibly, incredibly complex. And so understanding a method to help us wade through that complexity is important. So go to the next slide. So I would love it if life was this simple, if a patient had an encounter with a physician or a nurse or someone and then they were healthy and satisfied, right? That would be great. We wouldn't need quality improvement because it would just be a very linear and simple relationship. But actually, if you go to the next slide, and you can go one more, thanks. This isn't even probably as complex as it is, but there's so much interaction and interplay. And so understanding kind of the applied science that will help us lead change is really important. And over the years, there are many, many people who have studied and thought about the piece around how do we actually make change in complex environments. And so what I hope to do is share a little bit about that science. So if you go to the next slide, one thing that I think is really important to note is that it really is about kind of making sure that you have people who both know the subject matter experts. So I consider all of you on the phone to be subject matter experts. You care for women, you care for their babies, you really deeply understand the subject, and you have so much expertise to bring to the table. And we want to pair that with, and can kind of build the capability for all of you to kind of pair that with how we make change in complex environment, which is what we call the science of improvement knowledge. And we need both of those things to actually drive effective change. So if you go to the next slide, I thought I would just start with a few guiding principles. So this is the more theoretical part, and then we'll go into a more practical part. But I actually have a colleague who previously led some of IHI's work in Africa, and she told me she's now only teaching these guiding principles and not doing the practical part, which I promise I won't do, because she thinks they're so fundamental and so important to improvement. And so there's a couple of things that really guide our work when we think about how we make change in complex systems. So if you go to the first one, I think the first, and this just feels so important to me, is that this idea, and it actually is a quote from one of our longtime board members and advisors, Paul Batalden, which is every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. So if you feel like there's an opportunity to do better, to continue to improve your maternal mortality, for example, a severe morbidity, your system is perfectly designed to actually get your current outcomes. And I think there's 2 really important pieces to note about that. I think one is I deeply, deeply believe, I was a patient a year and a half ago, that each and every person on the phone today wants to provide good care. This is not a matter of people who don't want to provide good care. Everybody wants to provide really good care. And the systems and processes and culture and structures in which we work can get in the way of providing that good care. And so our job as improvers is really to deeply understand the system in which we make care. So I think that's one thing. The other thing to note is that sometimes it's very easy, as you see in this graphic, I'm sure glad the whole is not in our end, to get so fixated on the piece where we kind of work on the system or to make changes on one piece of the system only to learn that it's having effect on other pieces of the systems. And so having the opportunity to really map, for example, a patient journey, a woman's journey, to understand what it looks like, doing process mapping, having a theory about how you do your work, whatever that looks like in your setting, a way to really see the system and also understand why it's currently perfectly designed to produce outcomes that are not as good as you want them to be. And once again, not about kind of bad people. So the second principle is really about the idea, and if you go to the next slide, that learning requires intentionality. We all have things like hindsight bias and other ways that our brains are really efficient, but sometimes send us the wrong message. And so we kind of in all our improvement work, we want to make sure that, one, we're trying things in the real world safely, and not just iterating in conference rooms. I don't know about you, but I've had a lot of good ideas in conference rooms that have turned out not to be such great ideas when we tried them in the real world. And so the more that we can get to trying things safely in the real world, sometimes using simulation, sometimes using very small tests, finding ways to really do that safely, and not just spending all our times in conference rooms debating what it will be like when we try to put a complex change into the system. The other piece of this is that it kind of requires us to have a theory or a prediction, right? So that, I might have a theory that if we schedule postpartum visits, women will show up, and a prediction that 90% of women who are scheduled will show up. Well, then what happens? It turns out that only 20% show up for postpartum visits. And so by having that prediction, it allows me to actually be a little bit more thoughtful about how I actually go, oh, you know what? Not kind of saying, oh, I knew that was going to happen, but going, gosh, that's interesting. That's not what I was expecting. What might I learn from that? And so this practice, kind of having a theory or a prediction that allows you to see whether when you try things in the real world, they really turn out the way you thought. The third principle, and if you go to the next slide, is really about how we look at data. Our brains are really wired to find patterns even where there are none. And so this is an example I told you. I apply the science to my personal life all the time, but I like this commute time example because it gives you, when you ask someone how long it takes to commute to work, they say about 30 minutes or about 20 minutes or about 40 minutes or about 5 minutes, whatever it is, because one day it'll be 7 and one day it'll be 4. And then you can see that there's just some natural variation that's in the system, but sometimes we're quick to find a pattern and go, oh, we've gone up to, let's throw a pizza party. Oh, we've gone down to, let's go berate everybody on the unit, right? And so really making sure that we're looking at data in a way that helps us understand when there really are patterns and when there aren't patterns, so that we don't tinker with the system when it's just normal, kind of expected, takes me a little longer to get to work this day and not quite as long to get to work the next day. The last one, and I think really importantly, is this idea of kind of just really the human side of change. So obviously, I think you all know change would be quite easy without people, right? If we could just do exactly what we wanted and we didn't have to convince or work with people, but that's not the reality. And so it's not just a technical process. And one of the disciplines that guides our improvement work is how do we tap into people's kind of innate desire to do good? Like I said, I truly believe everybody on the line, most people in healthcare go into it because they want to help support people in improving their health. And I think even more so in obstetrics, where people are so mission driven. And so how do we really tap into that innate desire to do good in the world, and also understand that it's very natural for people to resist change. And so being thoughtful about what we put in place and expecting there to be some resistance, not expecting that people are just going to automatically kind of do things the way we want them done, but kind of planning for and thinking about that resistance. So those are the philosophies that helps guide improvement work. If you go to the next slide, so what I thought I would do is move from a philosophy to just talk a little bit about one improvement model that we use at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement that has helped, hopefully hundreds of thousands of folks in healthcare make change in their system. But I want to make a note, if you go to the next slide, that there's kind of a family of approaches here. So Lean or Six Sigma or total quality management. There are a lot of different and related approaches. And if you go to the next slide, I hope this will resonate with you. The way I think about this, and this actually comes from one of my colleagues who's a neonatologist in Pennsylvania, Mike Posenchek, who I've worked with quite a bit. And the way he describes these different methods is, if you say barbecue, it might mean different things if you go to different places, right? So I would predict in Georgia, if someone says barbecue, you have a mental model of what that is. I grew up in California, and if someone says barbecue, sometimes that also means that there are vegan options or the Impossible Burger or something along those lines. But at the end of the day, there's a couple of things that are really consistent and core across all of these methods. So there's meat involved, usually, or some form of meat substitute in California's case. There's fire and heat, right? And so that all of these methods are from the same family. And so whether you use Lean or Model for Improvement or Six Sigma, that all of these methods can really be used with some underlying principles, 5 principles that underlie all of these methods. So if you go to the next slide, so just a note that I won't we have a whole white paper if you're interested in learning about Lean and Model for Improvement and how they're what the similarities and differences might be. But I'm really going to walk through one model around learning and change. So this is the model we use, which is called the Model for Improvement. I'm just going to walk through a couple things to note before I do. One is that although these questions are listed sequentially, you can answer these questions in any order. So sometimes you might start with a measure, which is around how will we know that a change is an improvement, that you decide you actually want to improve. And then that will lead you to come up with an aim statement and then changes. Sometimes you have a change idea. You say, hey, we have this bundle or a checklist or something that we believe is going to make the care better, and you go back through. So don't feel like you have to answer these in the exact order. I'll walk through them top to bottom, but you can really start at any point in the model. So the first important piece around the Model for Improvement, if you go to the next slide, is around what we call our aim statement. And this is really about what are we trying to accomplish? And there's a couple of important things here. I think one is, it's amazing to me that sometimes I have been in rooms with a group of clinicians and you ask people, in your own words, just describe to me what you think you're trying to do. And each person actually tells a different story. One person is saying, we really want to sustain the great work we're already doing. Someone else is saying, I think we really need to make sure that we, pretty aggressively improve our care for hemorrhage patients. And a third person is saying, I'm not sure why I'm here. Someone just told me to come to the meeting. And so our aim statement is our guiding voice that helps us understand what we're trying to achieve. So if you go to the next slide, there are some key components of an aim statement that really helps that focus, right? And sometimes your aim is going to evolve. For all of this will be in pencil. The more you do your work, the more you're going to be able to get clearer and clearer about what you're trying to do. So I think probably most importantly, an aim statement has a what. So what's the focus of your improvement effort? How good do you want to be? So having a numerical goal for your outcome, and this is not about, that's the reason we have that numerical goal there, is not about judgment. It's about learning. It's that theory and prediction piece, which is to say, hey, we have a set of changes that we think can get us to this level of this reduction in maternal morbidity or severe maternal morbidity. And then we go about our work and we see, gosh, were those changes enough to get us to where we wanted to go? So that's the how good. By when, actually putting a time frame on it. And I really think this is important because you don't want to be on the never-ending improvement team. And so having a date at which you say, okay, you know what, a year from now, we're going to actually pause this improvement work, see where we've gone, and make a decision about whether we want to focus on something different? Has our data changed? Has anything about our work changed? So really thinking about that. For whom, like just making sure, and this goes back to that piece about making sure we're tapping into people's intrinsic motivation. So saying kind of we're doing this for the people that we serve, right? And just reminding people, kind of reorienting and refocusing people that all this hard work is really about making care better. And then where. So this is often an opportunity to really scope. If you have a process map, you might want to say, we're focusing on these steps in the process, but not those steps in the process. Or we're really focusing on risk assessment, and we're not yet doing some of this other work. It might also be about segments. We're gonna really focus on this category of women as opposed to everyone. So this where can also help you just scope in a way that kind of allows you. So let me give you an example. I know that all sounds very theoretical. So an aim statement for a team might be, if you go to the next slide. Oh, and sorry, I didn't realize it was building. You can, yeah. So, in order to support the health of our mothers, our team aims to improve our reliability with the hemorrhage bundle from 40% to 90% for all women delivering in our facility by December 2020. So what are you doing? You're really working on the reliable execution of the hemorrhage bundle. How good? You want to go from 40% to 90%, so getting to 90% reliability. By when? So that's December 2020. And once again, this is the opportunity for that team to actually pause, to recharter, to decide if you need new team members or different team members. For whom? That's the health of our mothers, right? The women that you're serving. And then the last piece is kind of where. And so in this case, it's actually going to be all women delivering in our facility. But you could have, of course, some boundary on that so that it gets there. So just if you go to the next slide, just a couple notes. So that's kind of aim statement, and I'll walk through all of this, but then I really am eager to hear kind of your feedback, what resonates, what works. So the second piece is kind of how will we know that a change is an improvement? And so if we have our aim statement, right, we also want to have a set of measures that guides our work. Now, you all have that already. Many of you are reporting data, looking at kind of outcome measures and process measures and other things. And so I predict many of you have a set of measures, but as a reminder, these measures are really about improvement and learning. They're not about judgment. And we want to look at these measures in a way that we understand what's normal variation and what's unexpected variation. So if you go to the next slide, just a couple of notes on kind of an example. So the outcome measure for you may be maternal mortality, although that's an extremely rare event, so it might also be severe maternal morbidity. The process could be something, I know your measures are structured slightly differently, but general overall reliability with the hemorrhage bundle. You could hold a theory that teamwork and communication is really going to be important to actually make that bundle work. If that's the case, you may have a process measure that is about teamwork and communication, right? And it could be a simple improvement measure. It could be you have ticks and tallies on the wall that say, hey, we're working as a team this week. You could have an anonymous one-question survey that goes out periodically. This is stuff where you're trying to understand if your changes you're making are leading to a difference. And then we always want to, we talked about that system, right? So we always want to make sure that we're not kind of squeezing one part and actually getting bulge in another part. And so we really recommend also having balancing measures for your work. How would you think about something like staff workload or patient experience or something that you say, okay, if we do this work, we got to make sure that it's not having an unintended impact on another part of our work. And often we see that is staff workload, finances, patient experience, volume, that type of things tend to be kind of the standard balancing measures that we look at to really make sure that those changes are not adversely affecting another piece of the system. So that's a little bit about measures. And I know you all have actually some data and looking at data over time. I'm not going to go into kind of all the rules about how we look at data over time and some ways to understand kind of statistically meaningful versus non-statistically meaningful variation. But certainly there are some whiteboard videos at the end that are free on IHI.org that walk through all of that for any of you that are interested in that. So if you go to the next slide. the third piece is, and once again, not sequentially, kind of what changes can we make that will result in improvement? So this is where we really get to build a theory of what we think we need to do that's going to lead to improvement. Now, you have already at your fingertips some wonderful content from AIM and ACOG and the Georgia PQC about how to support patients, hemorrhage patients. But you may also, like I said, you may have some other pieces of that theory that feel really important to actually add in there. So you may say, we need that, but we also need teamwork and communication. You may say, we also need some work to really understand kind of unconscious bias and the way that that might play out from an equity perspective. You might say, in addition to that bundle, we really need to communicate with families in a different way. And so just really encourage you in this, what changes can we make that will result in improvement, so that your team has a theory that includes whatever clinical changes you think you need to make, in addition to other things that you think might be required to really make it work. And just as an example of that, when I worked on our 5 Million Lives campaign, at the end of the campaign, we actually worked with Atul Gawande and his team to launch the surgical site list checklist. And one of the things that they found as they began to spread it is that originally the way it was intended was it was really a tool about teamwork and communication. And so the checklist, yes, it helped reduce reliance on human memory, which is great, but it also had this forcing function of a pause and reducing hierarchy in a way that allowed people to speak up and created safety. And what happened is, as that checklist got spread, some of the teamwork and communication and the psychology, safety, culture of safety piece got lost as it got spread, and it became just the checklist and then it wasn't very effective. Those teams, although it did help reduce reliance on human memory, really core to that checklist had been the culture of safety, the teamwork and communication, in addition to kind of reducing reliance on human memory. And so as you think about your work, think about what the equivalent might be for you. Just a note that I think if you go to the next slide, so there are multiple approaches to developing changes. I think you can understand processes and systems of work, which I predict many of you have done, which is, do you understand kind of the process flow in your system? Have you identified potential defects along the way and thought about how you might go about mitigating those defects? It could also be, because sometimes changes are high level, but sometimes the change idea would be a specific thing you're going to do differently tomorrow. So we're going to use this new risk assessment form. Or we're going to try to actually do a huddle where we pause and kind of think about how we're going to manage those who might be at higher risk. So that's kind of the level you want to get to. Creative thinking can be really helpful. Sometimes when your team is getting stuck, you've tried a couple of things, and I'm happy for anyone that's interested to send some resources around. And then what I predict and hope that many of you are doing is adapting known good ideas, right? You're taking things that people have put together. Hopefully you're learning from each other and saying, oh gosh, that's a really good idea. I would love to put that into my system as well. So if you go to the next slide, just a note that there are a lot of ways. So I focused on kind of the piece around understanding processes and systems of work, but there are more resources that, once again, I said I'm happy to provide if anybody wants. And understanding processes and systems, I think simple block diagrams, process mapping can be useful tools. We often use a driver diagram as well. Like I said, that's where you would put in kind of all the things. You might say, if you thought about kind of the outcome around improving outcomes for women, there may be something about kind of reliably delivering best practices. There may be another block that's really about that teamwork and communication. There could be another block that's really about kind of population management or connecting to community resources. And so whatever this would be for you, but you typically put the aim on the left, and then you identify a couple of things that you think are going to would primarily drive that aim. And then all the way on the right, you tend to have specific ideas. Here's the things we're actually going to run some PDSAs on as we go forward. So if you go to the next slide, So those first three questions, you're constantly iterating, right? You're improving your aim statement as you go. You're thinking about your measures. But one of the things that really kind of drives the model, and goes back to the philosophy that we actually try things in the real world, and we learn more from trying things in the real world rather than in conference rooms. And so we use plan, do, study, act cycles. There's only one in this picture of the model, but in reality, you're running tons of them. So you often start small. You might say, I'm going to try this new risk assessment with one patient, this new risk assessment form with one patient. You try it with one patient. You learn the questions are confusing. The staff don't understand. Okay, you know what? We're now going to go modify the form, and we're going to try it again with 2 patients. And the idea is it's not that you stay small. You start small so we can learn with the minimal risk of how it works in the conference room, right? If I implement a new form, suddenly I have kind of everybody trying to use a new form that turns out is not all that clear. And so we want to try things small and then build up to the point where it becomes, where you actually implement it, it becomes the way that we go about doing things. So that's kind of the model. Let me give you an example of a plan, do, study, act. There's kind of a way we go about it, right? So if you go to the next slide, in the plan portion, we actually say, what are we going to do and how are we going to know if this change actually worked? So if I wanted to know if a huddle improves identification and management of hemorrhage patients, right, then I say, okay, my first try, I'm going to try it with, we're going to try a huddle one day on one shift to see whether this huddle works. And so I might put a whole plan, I put the plan together, I put steps to execute, and then I actually want to say, gosh, did that PDSA, did that plan go as I thought it would? And that's in the do part. So you put in the do part. So in this example, only 2 staff members showed up to the huddle. So that's an important thing to know, right? Because you want to understand whether, if you're going to decide what you're going to actually do next, you want to decide, was the plan actually executed as we thought it would be? And then you want to study. So you actually make predictions at the beginning. Like I said, that helps you actually compare. It helps our brains from getting caught in some of the traps that our brains get trapped in. So we predicted 6 people would show up to the huddle, but only 2 people were there. We predicted it would take 20 minutes, but it only took 10 minutes, but there were only 2 people there. So we think it might be longer if there were more people. We had predicted that we'd be able to identify a handful of patients of high risk, and we were able to kind of discuss the management plan, although not everyone was there. So next you say, okay, what did I conclude from this cycle and what am I going to do next? Often we use A's just to make it easy to remember. Am I going to abandon this? You know what? This huddle didn't work. I don't think we can ever get more than 2 people to show up. This wasn't a good idea. Am I going to adapt it? Well, the huddle was a good idea, but I think we're not doing a good time of the day. So we're actually going to adapt it to be a different time of the day. Or am I going to adopt it? I say, hey, the huddle worked perfectly, just like we planned. Let's begin to scale it up with more people. And I will say the thing that I love about plan, do, study, act cycles, so I think one of the most precious and valuable resources we have in healthcare is your time. And so when we do small plan, do, study, act cycles that help us learn in the real world, we actually save your time, right? And we want to be really thoughtful about our staff and our staff's time, and trying things in a way that allows them to kind of iteratively learn as we go. So if you go to the next slide. Just kind of a couple of notes before I just kind of on the screen here. These are all free resources. We hope you'll take advantage. If you're really interested and you want to learn more, the IHI Open School 102 is a free course that runs through the model for improvement in a little bit more detail. And then we also have these whiteboard videos. So if you want to know more about measures, like I said, you're interested in run chart rules and how to actually know the difference between things that are changes and things that are just random variation. We also have a ton of tools there, so if you're new to, let's say, root cause analysis or process mapping or driver diagrams and you want to use one of those tools, you can use that as well. I think there may be just a couple of tips on kind of managing improvement that I'll note, and then I really want to hear what questions and comments you have. So the first tip I would have is just scoping the project and making sure everyone is clear. And your aim statement can really help with that, but also kind of a charter can really help, where you just say who's on the team, what are we doing, how are we going to go about our work. I think, two, is taking the time to really build a team of individuals that represent the system you're trying to improve. And so if you can also include women, even better, right? Women who have delivered in your facility previously, who may be able to help, hey, when you communicate with patients in this way, or someone who had an event that you think is important to learn from, but also just making sure that you're not leaving someone out who's a critical touch point along the way. Sometimes transport, for example, can be really key in some of the improvement. A third tip is just avoiding analysis paralysis, right? We want good enough data to help us learn about whether the energy we're investing in making these changes is leading to improvement. The fourth tip is just to make things meaningful and fun. So making sure that your team is taking time to talk about why this work is important to you, what you hope to learn as a part of the project. I predict you all have really creative ways to make it meaningful and fun. And sometimes we do more work on the fun than the meaningful, and we want to figure out how to make sure it's both of that. I think just kind of like I said, putting everything in pencil, so making sure that you're iterating as you go and you don't get stuck feeling like things have to be perfect. We often say that lamination is the enemy of improvement. And then I think, just making it easy to do the work right. So the more that your team can have, like, here's our standard agenda, 15-minute huddle for improvement teams where you have a really standard way you go about it, kind of having everything in one place, putting things in break room walls where people can take a look and maybe comment and make notes as well can be really helpful.